Awesome. Hey, it's a pleasure to be here today, or virtually be here. I just want to say I really appreciate Ross's hard work with Plant Select too. And I agree with Brian. He comes from all those facets that really make him successful at this, and really a great promoter and knows his plant material. I am a big supporter of Plant Select, especially the native plants that are introduced, and they've done a great job of that as well. Today, we're going to take a whirlwind tour of the Great Plains, and we're going to talk about some really interesting plants, but we're also going to talk about some interesting topography, believe it or not, and the niches that make some of these incredible plants that come from the Great Plains so special. And we all love a good open sky because we've been cooped up a lot lately. So without further ado, let's get going. And I'm going to set my timer so I do not go over rust. Okay, Central North American Great Plains, or the North American Central Steppe. Basically, I spent about 10 years out here in extreme eastern to central Kansas at a botanic gardens that dealt exclusively in native plants of the Great Plains. But we're going to look a lot at even up north into Nebraska, and we're going to dip down into Texas, New Mexico, at least the Texas Panhandle as well, because there's a lot of interesting things that go on there. You notice too, most people think of this area as extremely flat, and it's that 500 miles between Denver and Kansas City that we must bear. But I'm going to show you some interesting physical features and the plants that thrive in those particular areas. This is a tough area. Don't ever let anybody tell you it's not. Extremes of weather, precipitation, heat, drought is a normal thing. The old saying is the only thing that keeps the Arctic from flowing to the Great Plains in the wintertime is 3 strands of barbed wire. Is pretty true. I think a lot of you probably heard recently about the derecho that hit Iowa. It's a huge downburst and straight line winds that caused billions of dollars in damage. They're not common on the Great Plains, but I have experienced one where the wind went from about a 5-mile-an-hour breeze to about 100 miles an hour, and it lasted for like 40 seconds. Tore up trees and everything else. It's an amazing thing. But torrential downpours, tornadoes, call it Tornado Alley. Fire is a big part of this region too, not so much now that a lot of the land has been converted to agricultural use, but traditionally fire was a big habitat shaping element in the tall grass prairies, especially over in the Flint Hills, in the more in the upper Midwest. The mixed grass prairies as well through the central part of this region burned extensively too. The short grass prairie, believe it or not, quite as frequent fire regime, but it's still there. And of course, extremes of drought. This is a photo, I call this the dry western edge. It's Juniperus monosperma, and of course, Opuntia. This is down in some of the driest parts of the Front Range in Colorado. It averages about 8 inches of rainfall a year. It's in the shadow of the wet mountains, just south of Florence, Colorado, and it's a tough, tough area. So this is one of the extremes that we experience in this area. But we can have amazingly lush prairies and foothills in years that it actually rains, this not being one of them. But it has an amazing flora even on this dry western edge. This is a prairie restoration we did at Chatfield Farms a number of years ago. And of course, it's morphed over the years from then. And I'll show you a photo of it that was just taken recently. We have some amazing plants though. Townsendia grandiflora. This is growing right in a little prairie that's adjacent to Chatfield Farms. Not so long lived in cultivation, but an amazing spring boomer. Of course, as we move north along this area, the Flatirons, everybody recognizes them. We're actually a little bit wetter here than we are in southern Colorado, around 16 inches of rainfall a year versus more like 12 down to 8. And as you get into New Mexico, even 6 and 7 along the Front Range in those plains areas as well. Fisher's Peak. This is a centerpiece of a brand new Colorado State Park that's going to open, I believe, next year. This is an amazing, diverse area along the Raton mesas. These ponderosa pine and a lot of the associated oak go clear out into the Oklahoma Panhandle, believe it or not. And Black Mesa is kind of the tail end of those, and I have been to that area, and it's fascinating. And all the area along the Cimarron River that flows out this way too. Great plant diversity there. The Sangre de Cristo Range down in Mexico, and of course the shortgrass prairie that fronts it. Another shot of the Sangres from up in southern Colorado. This is taken from high up in the Webb Mountains, and I wanted to bring this up because montane steppe, and especially in the Webb Mountains, follows clear up until about 10,500 feet on these dry western slopes. You'll see grama grass in full bloom up here in usually mid-August if they get the rainfall. But we even have some great old pines. And looking straight ahead here, that's Medano Pass that breaks over into the great sand dunes of the San Luis Valley. Amazingly rich area when the rainfall is good. This was taken up on the head of Hardscrabble Pass on one of these dry slopes in June. Penstemon and paintbrush. This is also the habitat of Clematis hirsutissima variascatii, which is one of our great plant select plants. This is it taken in the wild in a pretty dry year, but it's a tough, resilient plant and a great addition to plant select. So let's talk a little bit about some of the substrates. All across the Great Plains, up into the foothills of the Rockies and the Front Range, we have a lot of different substrates. Mostly I'm going to talk about limestone and sandstone substrates, because that's the most common out in the Great Plains. And this is just a shot of a rock down in the Smoky Hills of Kansas, are loaded with fossils. This was all a giant inland sea at one time before the Rocky Mountains rose. So we get out onto the plains and we think, oh, we leave the trees behind. Amazingly enough, out on the Rickery headwaters, this is out just north of Lyman, Colorado, we find abundant forest cover in some of these deep canyons and draws, ponderosa pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, and a lot of associated interesting plants with them in these niche areas. Pawnee Buttes, I think a lot of us have been there. Fascinating area with some interesting flora as well. More of a limestone substrate. And it doesn't end there. Chalk pyramids, this is out in west central Kansas. Some very interesting species associated with these particular formations. And this is really just exposed Ogallala aquifer formation, which underlies a big part of the western Great Plains. Castle Rocks, as you move just a little bit east of there, and more of a yellow limestone, but it's still part of the Ogallala formation. So here's a friend, Amorphinana, another great plant selection. Down in some of these deep canyons in western Kansas, especially southwest Kansas, you will find Amorphinana growing. It's kind of an isolated population from its main home in the upper Midwest. And of course, we have the remnant population up in the foothills above Boulder as well. Awesome plant. And if you go down these deep canyons, you can find it growing vigorously in some of the layers of the Ogallala aquifer. Clark State Lake in southwest Kansas is a great place. Okay, we have to throw in some human culture as well. El Corralillo is the most farthest northeast pueblo ever built by the Pueblo Indians. This is at Scott State Lake, another one of these deep canyons in western Kansas. And what's amazing about it is it was formed in the late 1600s after the Spanish started to colonize New Mexico. Some of the Pueblo Indians migrated out of their, from under their thumb and formed their own pueblo in this deep canyon with some really deep aquifer water that springs to life in here. What's interesting about this state park, and I've never quite figured it out, If you look back over your shoulder by looking at this picture, you'll find a lone ponderosa pine growing in the park. Had to be planted because it's well over 100 miles from anything, even Black Mesa. I'll find out about it someday. So as we move east into these limestone ridges and undulating valleys of central Kansas, this is where we find our Scutellaria resinosa. Smoky Hill is a great addition. I think it was developed originally by Harlan Hammernick, the great plantsman of Nebraska. We miss him still. But this is just how abundant it can be on some of these rocky ridges. Moving farther east, we get into some of the sandstone formations of central Kansas. This is Coronado Heights. It's a province. It's just south of I-70 before you get into Salina, Kansas. And it has its own unique group of perennials that occurs on this sandstone formation, pretty much surrounded by heavy clay soils. And one of those is Tradescantia tharpii. It's a little miniature or the dwarf Tradescantia. It's a great plant. I admit I've never got it to perform as well in Colorado as it did in cultivation where I was at in Kansas, but it's still a worthwhile plant. It tends to be a little brief blooming in the spring, but it's loaded full of flowers a lot of times. And then it just kind of goes dormant. It only gets about 8 to 10 inches high, sometimes a little taller, but it tolerates really keenly drained sand and gravelly soils. So let's move up a little bit into north central Kansas and south central Nebraska, the post-rock country. They call it the post-rock country because of these unique layered formations. And you'll see the post up above there. There was so few trees when the settlers moved out into this part of the world that they had to use post-rock that was quarried from these formations to hold their fences up. And there's some incredibly beautiful limestone buildings in this country as well. So we get up into post-rock country, and here's an old friend of the Fremont evening primrose growing abundantly on these scree slopes of limestone up in this part of the world. And you can find so many leaf variations on Fremontii, from grass-like thin to slightly wider, and all shades of silver down to more of a greenish color in this area. I think there's some more work to do there, but we have some outstanding selections of Fremontii already. One of my absolute favorites, and I'm a bit of a dahlia nut, although I'm not going to talk a lot about them today, but Dahlia aurea, the golden flower dahlia, silky dahlia is another word for it. It occurs up in this area, and you can even find it down more into central Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas as well on certain soil substrates. It's a bit ephemeral, but it's worth growing just for its incredible little ring of flowers and also the silky seed head. Of course, let's jump up into the sandhills of Nebraska. We can't forget about that massive physical feature, and it's the headwaters of the Ogallala Aquifer. It's like a big funnel that absorbs the water and then feeds it into the formation that runs clear down into Texas. The blow-out penstemon hollii. Some of the major rivers that cross this area, and we don't go clear up into the Missouri River. That's a whole nother presentation. More of a cool season prairie up in that part of the world, but the Platte River in Nebraska, the Arkansas River, which is very key to this part of central Kansas. You get some amazing seasonal, especially spring displays in this area. Delphinium borescens, Engelmannia peristinia, I think I said that right. I'm still go by Pinnatifida, and of course our little fire wheel, and look at this, purple poppy mallow too in these little sand sage prairies. There's a little close-up of poppy mallow and Engelmannia. You have to be out there at just the right times there. Amazingly enough, Eustoma grandiflora grows in southwest Kansas around ephemeral ponds, especially in the grasslands out in this part of the world. It's pretty bleak country, but around these ephemeral ponds, you'll find Eustoma grandiflora growing in the sand along the edges of these ponds. And then you get up on the uplands and our big Opuntia imbricata becomes more prominent clear down into Oklahoma as well. Oh boy, down into the Canadian River. And the Canadian River is kind of a misnomer because most of the time it's dry this far west. Mesquite, this is where you pick up mesquite. Actually, you can find mesquite growing in extreme southwest Kansas and southeast Colorado, and then down into the Texas Panhandle where it becomes very prominent and even farther south. When I go to Arizona in the springtime, I'm always so jealous of those incredible mesquite trees and the honey mesquite. We need to work on finding a mesquite that we can grow in this part of the world. They're incredible plants. So let's jump way east now. We're getting into the real wetter part of the particular area I'm talking about today, the Flint Hills of Kansas. As high as 36 inches of rainfall a year in the eastern parts of this, and that's where you start to get into more woody vegetation. The Flint Hills are really a special place to me. I spent a lot of time, actually lived in the edge of the Flint Hills for a time when I spent 10 years in Kansas. But there's a diverse array of perennials that occurs in the Flint Hills. And the interesting things, I'm talking about perennials and then I jump to an annual. Here's a really interesting plant, Eryngium leavenworthii, and I think a lot of us are familiar with rattlesnake eryngo or the perennial one, but this one is an annual that occurs in really disturbed places in the Flint Hills and down southward into Oklahoma. And it puts on stunning displays when it colors up in the fall. I don't recommend moving it around though, because I introduced it to the garden I worked at in central Kansas, and it can be kind of a problem, but it's amazingly interesting plant. Bulbs in the Flint Hills. Nemestitis geminiflora. I'm not recommending we try to put this one into cultivation. It's difficult, but it's a stunningly beautiful little member of the iris family that occurs in the Flint Hills in hard clay soils down into more wet clay soils. Okay, this is a plant I've talked about before, and I'm going to really, this is an amazing penstemon, and let me tell you why it's so amazing. It occurs in the Flint Hills, and even back farther east, but it reaches its westernmost extent in the Flint Hills. This penstemon grows in heavy clay soils. This penstemon grows in wet soils. Can't think of too many penstemons that will tolerate those kind of conditions. Spring bloomer, clear white foliage, really compact fluorescence, gets about 18 inches tall with numerous fluorescent heads on it. It's an amazing penstemon, and I think we should grow more of it. One of those reasons is a lot of these Flint Hills penstemons I think are really adaptable to garden cultivation, and this being one of the most adaptable in cultivation penstemons there is. I threw this one in because it has obvious faults, but I love Baptisias. It's this creamy yellow bloom that's really unique. Not a great candidate for cultivation because it tends to hold its inflorescences down near the ground, but it's really an interesting plant. It has all those qualities that Baptisias bring to the garden. It's from the Flint Hills. It's tough. It's adaptable. Heavy clay soils don't bother it a bit. And then, of course, in the Flint Hills, we have a lot of limestone outcroppings as well, mixed with chert that these things grow in too. Okay, let's jump down into central Kansas, south central Kansas, and north central Oklahoma. The Red Hills, it's one of the most stunningly beautiful places in the whole of the Great Plains that I've had the fortunate experience to visit, and I've been almost all over the Great Plains at one place or another. The Red Hills are sandstone flecked with gypsum crystals. You can literally pick gypsum crystals off the ground down in this part of the world. Heavy tree cover from eastern red cedar, which is unusual in Kansas to say the least. And some really unique plants that grow down in here. Tephrosia virginica is the go-through. It's kind of my holy grail. I'm going to figure out how to cultivate this thing yet. I've got the seeds to germinate, but I can't get the plants to persist. One of these days, I'm going to make a run back out and get some more plants or some more seed and see if we can get this thing. It has some kind of symbiotic or parasitic relationship with some of the other plants, so it's a little tricky, but it has these unique green, yellow, and kind of reddish pink flowers, a legume, of course. Okay. Just one other plant I want to mention before we move on from the Red Hills. I think a lot of you remember Bluebird's introduction of Comanche campfire Enothera. That was another Harlan Hammernick introduction that comes from the Red Hills of Oklahoma and Kansas as well. It had those really unique deep red petioles on the leaves and the flowers. Awesome plant. So another interesting plant down in this part of the world is Berlandiera texana, and I think we're all familiar with chocolate flower, its cousin. And you know, I gotta admit, I've grown chocolate flower for a lot of years, and I never could figure out why they call it chocolate flower, even though people said, oh, it's got this amazing chocolate aroma. But about 2 years ago, out in front of our schoolhouse on a really hot, calm day, I walked down the path and I was overcome by the chocolate smell from the Berlandiera chocolate flower. Amazing. Okay, unfortunately, Texana does not have that scent, but it has those unique flowers. And this is a real variable species. It occurs farther back in Missouri, and it gets fairly tall and lanky, but it has these clusters of these unique flowers on top. But if you find this out more in the western part of the Great Plains, it tends to be more compact. It has a few less flower stalks, but they tend to be more widely spaced. And I think it's an interesting candidate eventually for some kind of cultivation. Stay tuned. Okay, I'm going to go into a lot of some of the, what I finally like to call some of the good general plants that I grow and have grown to love since my time in the Great Plains. Ruellia humilis. It's kind of an overlooked little species. Interesting, it occurs mostly in the Flint Hills out into central Kansas, and you'll find it even farther west on these real limey substrates. It blooms during the hottest part of the summer. It's really tough. It brings this beautiful little lavender, light purple flowers to it. It blooms continuously if you continue to give it a little bit of water, even in the hottest part of the season. Compact, kind of moves around. It'll self-seed in some of the looser soils. We grow it extensively out here at Chatfield Farms and some of the prairie beds. And it's always just a nice little spot of color during those doldrums of summer, as I like to say. So Ruellia humilis, easy from seed. Let's get back to penstemons. I talked about, of course, Penstemon tubiflorus, which is one of the most adaptable, but also from the Flint Hills is the Penstemon cobea or cobea penstemon, one of the most stunning penstemons that I've ever grown. And this one, unfortunately, not quite as adaptable to cultivation as some of the other great penstemons that are in the Plant Select program. It tends to be a little ephemeral, 2-3 years of really good bloom, and then it kind of fades out, which is typical of a lot of penstemons. But there's a purple or a purple lavender form like this that we've had in the front beds in front of our visitor center for a number of years. And let me tell you, when we hosted APGA in 2014, this was in full bloom when everybody got off the bus. And I can't tell you, out of probably 80% of all the attendees, over 200 of them, stopped to ooh and ah over this plant and to take photos. And it just really is stunning. It's got that glaucous green foliage. It's got the delicate little pollinator lines. They're like runway lights for bees to get down inside those things. Bumblebees love these things. And it's a stunning plant. I wish we could find a form that was a little more persistent in the garden. So in the Flint Hills, generally what you find is this really pale lavender color as opposed to the dark lavender color. Just a stunning note. Easy to grow from seed. One of my favorite penstemons of all time, and I haven't found a penstemon I didn't like. Okay, Larry, you're going to talk about sunflowers. I love sunflowers. I know they can be a little tenacious sometimes in cultivated situations. Don't get me wrong. This is a willow leaf sunflower, and it is truly one of the most stunning sunflowers around, and there's a lot of them. But what's unique about this is that grass-like foliage. Very adaptable to garden situations. The big drawback, it's rhizomatous. I wouldn't call it overly aggressive, but can it be a little pushy? It's not as bad as some of our Maximilian sunflowers, which we considered when I was in the Midwest just a horrible thug. This was nowhere near that. Here's a shot of it growing in the thick arboretum plains next to the pond. It does prefer a little extra moisture, but it makes a stunning display, and people always used to ask me, what is this amazing plant growing along there? Even when it wasn't blooming, they're just enthralled by the foliage. Okay, we've got a lot of incredible sages and Plant Select, and they're just awesome additions to the entire repertoire. This is kind of a long and lanky one, but it's got to be one of my absolute favorite is Salvia azurea. And the reason I love this plant is it comes on in August right now. It's blooming. I just took these photos, I think yesterday or the day before. Incredible color. The foliage is, to me, is really attractive. I think there are some shorter, more compact forms that I think would really be appropriate in more traditional gardens for sure. But this plant seems to be really hard to find, and even a lot of times by seed, it's a little difficult to find. But I tell you, bumblebees, I can't believe how they're attracted to this plant. And if we're really going to support a lot of our pollinators, I think this is a key plant to have in any kind of habitat garden. I promised you another picture of the prairie I showed you early on. Well, this one, I didn't quite get it good in the background, but it's morphed over the years into more of a mixed grass prairie in behind here now. But Salvia azurea, and there is a white form that you can find seed for occasionally. Okay, another awesome plant, and I know a lot of people have talked about this plant, Liatris ligula stylus. As Liatris go, to me it's every bit as stunning as Liatris pycnostachia, which grows in the tall grass prairies of the Flint Hills. But this guy is found more in the west, and I actually found it in the wild in Colorado too, finally. I credit Lauren Springer Ogden for really bringing my attention to this plant, but it's blooming right now. It pairs well with goldenrod, flat top goldenrod that's blooming right now. It has slightly longer peduncles than some of the other similar species like punctata, which is much shorter and tolerates drier soils. But look at that. Isn't that incredible? Just in the strap flowers really put it on. And this is very adaptable to garden situations, and it kind of seeds around in a lot of our prairies. It tolerates drier soils. It likes fairly loose soils, although it tolerates some clay. Well, look at this. I found it in the wild. This is a little wet meadow. It's on the edge of a wet meadow in Wet Mountain Valley, believe it or not, where I'm from. And I found this in full bloom in August. Asked permission from the landowner and collected a few seeds. We got the strain going, but it seems a little finicky, and I'm sure Mike Bone and Drew will agree with me. It seems a little slow and finicky in the pot, but it's definitely worth a look, folks. Amazing. So I wanted to throw in a comparison because when I was in the Great Plains for 10 years, I fell in love with Liatris aspera, which is very similar species, usually slightly taller, but it grows in dry prairies off the west flank of the Flint Hills into central Kansas and some of the tight clay soils. It has shorter peduncles on the inflorescence. The strap flowers aren't quite as spectacular, but this real compact head, it still makes it an interesting plant for garden usage. And it is very adaptable to gardens. I think it's one we need to look at more at as well. There's just a little bit of a close-up when it's really the strap flowers are starting to emerge. Okay, we have an amazing array of grasses and plant select. We have thin man Indian grass. Indian grass is really, it's just an incredibly beautiful plant to me. And I think we could use lots and lots of more cultivars of this that highlight some of the bluer foliage and really highlight some of the seed heads too. But I'm so grateful we got thin man into cultivation. We have awesome, standing ovation, little blue stem, great one for the gardens, and you can't have too much little blue stem in the gardens. But this Indian grass, I think, really deserves more attention for cultivation. Coming on right now in full bloom. Another one I wanted to kind of highlight too, and it has some drawbacks, I understand that, but Butaloa curtipendula or Cytodes carama. I took this photo yesterday and I apologize for my ugly car in the background. Grace Johnson, who's our, Ross mentioned, is our very talented plant select gardener, has this growing in our xeriscape border in front of the schoolhouse. And these guys have really come on this year. I love those pendant flowers and seed heads. It's just amazing. We have a lot of California poppies. It pairs well with most everything. This bed is pretty much gravel, but I love this arching habitat and the big clump it provides. You know, one of the big drawbacks to this is it tends to fade fairly quickly. Not the most long-lived grass in the world, but still interesting to say the least. Deserves wider attention, I think. Okay, I'm going to talk about some obsessions that I've recently acquired. And Corydalis aurea, subspecies aurea, amazing plant. It occurs from out in the Great Plains. I first noticed it in eastern Colorado and extreme. I picked it up in western Kansas on a wet spring bloomer. Kind of forms this mound of beautiful cut foliage and then these beautiful blooms that come on. And where I really reconnected with this plant once I got back to Colorado, I'd kind of forgotten about it. But in a fire burn area in the wet mountains down in southern Colorado, where it opened up a ponderosa pine forest, this was just going crazy a few springs ago when they had a lot of moisture. And I really think it has some interesting possibilities for big spring display. It tends to be a little short-lived, tends to be a little ephemeral. It likes rocky soils. I've seen it growing in more sandy soils, but just a really beautiful plant. Another little bit of an obsession that's come from the very eastern edge of the Great Plains up into the foothill, or western edge of the Great Plains up into the foothills. Clematis columbiana variety Tenua loba. I saw this on the same day that I ran back into the Corydalis. I love the kind of handkerchief flowers on this. It's always been attracted to me in the clematis species with those kinds of flowers. The foliage is interesting, and I apologize for this giant dandelion growing in this photo, but this is another species that grows kind of on rocky slopes and open, kind of those open ponderosa pine forests. I think it deserves more cultivation, and I want to get this one definitely into cultivation at Chatfield Farms. So I'm going to wrap it up here a little bit, but a couple of things I wanted to bring up. We have Calolophus seriolatus in cultivation with Plant Select. I think there's some good forms out there that could use some more work as well, that may be a little bit longer lived too. And Calophus is extremely very popular as you move south of the Great Plains. Like Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center has some interesting forms as well. I wanted to show this photo simply because this plant is super tough, and it kind of personifies a lot of these plants from the Great Plains. They grow in difficult situations. This guy's growing out of the porous rock of the Ogallala Aquifer. They can tolerate extremes of wind, hail, all those really tough extremes of temperature. Last time I was out in this area as many years ago with PK and Mike Bone, and they were in a severe drought. It was over 100 degrees. Calophus was still blooming. They hadn't had rain in months. And so was the Enothera macrocarpa subspecies incana. Just kind of a testament to the major resilience of these incredible plants out on the plains. So I also want to mention, don't forget the pollinators. And I threw this photo in because I was so amazed that I actually caught this white-lined sphinx moth working over some cleomes. I just wanted to put in a plug for natives and the pollinators that they do attract, and they don't always attract our native pollinators. Well, they do, but they also attract our honeybees, which are every bit as important in terms of the support we give them from our gardens and our habitats that we restore. And at Chatfield Farms, this is number one of our priorities, is supporting the wild insects that create all the wonderful pollinating pollinator services. So in closing, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. We got two amazing speakers coming up in Kenton and Mike Hinchin. They have amazing talents and amazing plants, and I'm going to tune in for those if I get a chance as well. But I want to say diversity, diversity, diversity. And Plant Select personifies that diversity. And I want to promote really diverse plantings. I am a prairie person, and I've got a question about prairies that I will answer here after the presentation. I'll email that in, Ross.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, thank you.